Wright for being here at 4 o'clock. I know it's the last panel of the day, but hopefully it will be your favorite before you leave us, because I am so elated that I want to say that I have the best panel here, okay? And so I'm not going to introduce any of them, okay? I'm going to let them tell you who they are, because who better to tell you about themselves than the actual people who are here in the room themselves. And I guess I'm going to say we're going from the left to the right today, okay?
Hello, I'm Dolen Perkins-Valdez. I am originally from Memphis, but I now live in D.C. My latest book is Happy Land. This is my 4th historical novel, and I'm glad y'all hung in there today. I know it's been a long day.
Woo!
I'm David Wright Faladé. I live in Austin, Texas right now. I grew up in Texas too. My book, The New Internationals, is set in post-war Paris. I didn't think of myself as an historical fiction author, but I keep getting called that, so I'm going to assume that that's what I'm doing. I'm writing historical fiction. So.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Paul Burch. I was originally born in Washington, D.C. I live in Nashville now. I've been a musician and a recording artist there for a long time. And my first debut novel is why I'm here today. It's called Meridian Rising, and it's based on the life, it's kind of an imagined memoir of Jimmy Rogers, who was the late 1920s, early 30s musician who had a huge influence on American music, from Robert Johnson to Bob Dylan. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Vanessa Miller. I am born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, but I have been living in Charlotte, North Carolina for the past 12 or 13 years. And I have written over 50 novels, but my newest book is The Filling Station, which is about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.
See what I'm talking about? Who knows them better than themselves, right? So, of course, my first challenge to my panel is I want you all to imagine that we're in an elevator, right? And I said we had to be on there for at least 1 to 2 minutes. What could you kind of sum your novel up as being, and what would you tell me that would make me want to buy that book while we're in the elevator? I'm at Barnes & Noble, and I'm pushing submit to cart right now, okay? And this time we're gonna go from the right to the left, okay?
Well, I would tell you that The Filling Station it's not just about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, but it is about resilience. It is about a group of people who would not give up and would not give in, and their story of how they were able to rebuild their community after such devastation will warm your heart.
Okay. And it's phenomenal, you all. I can't wait for y'all to hear her talk more about it. It was one of my best reads of last year, okay? So if you follow Melanated Reader, you know I couldn't shut my mouth about that book, okay?
I'm going to give the stuck elevator pitch, but it's as I said, the story of Jimmy is an imagined memoir, and it's really like a sort of a spiritual journey. Every other chapter is an interview with someone from Jimmy's life, and the person interviewing is not revealed until the end of the book. So you get an idea of what Jimmy's life is like, both as a musician and as a person, and how all of these people in his life contributed to not only a very extraordinary life, but a life that actually has touched people all around the world with his music.
And if you're nosy like me, then of course that's right up your alley, okay? Because clearly I was very nosy going through this book, and I'm like, oh, who is he talking about? But you know, it was very interesting, to say the least. All right, next.
The New Internationals is a Paris novel. It's set in the immediate aftermath of the war, and it tells the story of a love triangle between a Holocaust survivor, a young woman who's a Holocaust survivor, an African from the colonies who's in school in Paris, and a black GI. And it's at that moment when, you know, these three people have suffered oppressions in different sorts of ways, and they feel like they're young, and they feel like they're at the cusp of being able to create a new world. So there's a lot of hopefulness, and it's a triangle, so somebody's gonna end up sad.
Yes, you're correct. Somebody is definitely going to end up sad, okay? All right, Dolen.
I also have a love triangle in my book. What's going on here?
Yes, Lord. Yes, she does.
Yeah, we love triangles, don't we?
We love some good mess, yes.
So Happy Land is inspired by the true story of a group of people in the late 1800s, freed people who fled Klan violence in Spartanburg County, South Carolina, and went up into the mountains of western North Carolina and created their own community that they called a kingdom, and they named a king and a queen.
All right, so I think I'm going to go into this because each one of these periods that they wrote in, I was just like, what would make them want to write during this particular period? So I just want to ask the panel, so why did you choose the specific period that you wrote in, and why do you think that it was so important to show those voices in today's time? Anybody?
I don't mind starting, in part because I'm still thinking about the characters, in part because they're based on my parents. So yeah, I have this sort of complicated backstory, and in the back of my head as I've been trying to, figure out how to be a writer, I also imagine trying to, figure out that story and tell that story. And so I finally did as fiction, but because I was at the beginning of my research, beyond just sort of, knowing my parents, like interviews and doing more grounded research, the story has continued to grow. So I finished the novel, which tells this very specific story and is very fictionalized, but I'm still thinking about them. But it's fundamentally, my mother was born in 31 and survived the war, and after the war was very outraged and was she never renounced sort of Judaism. She always wore a Star of David prominently, but she embraced anti-colonialism and that, and she fell in love with this young African man who was descended from the kings of Dahomey. And Dahomey is that piece of West Africa that was called the Slave Coast. They were slave trading Africans. He was descended from those kings. They had this falling out, and she rushed into the arms of a black guy who was descended from slaves necessarily. So that triangle of the love of the Holocaust survivor and the descendant of enslaved people and the descendant of slave traders strikes me still as interesting.
And as I told you guys, I've written over 50 novels, and this one is my second historical. The American Queen was my first. So I'm not necessarily caught into a time period, because the first one was 1800s, this is 1920, and then the one I'm writing on now, I go back to the 1800s. So it's not the time period for me, it's more the story and history that I'm trying to tell. And it would be so easy if I would just stick with one time period, because then I could just use all of that research for the next book. But no, I don't make it that easy for me. So it's more story than time period, I would say, for myself.
My story takes place in the 1920s and early 30s, and but it's not, I don't feel like it's too. Didn't really have to worry about the time period too much, mostly because music is really central to my story as a person, and I chose Jimmy because, interestingly enough for me, his time period was right when my grandparents were born in the 20s and 30s. And I had a really great relationship with them, long relationship. They lived to be into their 80s and 90s. So if you grew up in the 70s and 80s when there weren't as many television stations, there was always one television station at night that played black and white movies, old Charlie Chaplin, Laurel and Hardy films. So Jimmy's era was never that far from me. But I liked him because, to me, I may have said this already, he's kind of the town square where all American music meets. He's the very first kind of international entertainer, one of the first people you could say was a singer-songwriter. But he also, he never lost his rural accent. He was greatly inspired by not only black music, but black theater at the time, which was telling truth-telling songs, speaking in such a way where the audience could really relate to the singer at a time when people weren't doing that. And he just had a seismic influence on American music. But he's also like a really interesting person, seems to be a nice person, He recorded with Louis Armstrong. He was friends with Howlin' Wolf, and he just seemed like a fascinating person. So as a musician, I could write about him without thinking of the tropes of the time period too much. It sneaks in there, but for me as well, it was mostly about the story of someone discovering themselves. And he was dying of tuberculosis at the time, so he really saw that his life on Earth was very finite. And he could also see he was having a huge influence on music, which is what he always wanted to get into full time.
I always wanted to write about this period, which is the late 1800s, but I thought it was too dark. You know, we had the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876 that ended Reconstruction in the South. A lot of you all know about the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1890. And we also had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And I just was not prepared to write about what many historians call the nadir of African American experience until I found this story. And the thing that struck me about this story, even though they were fleeing violence, even though they were coming out of South Carolina where we'd had these KKK trials of 1872, they were so brilliant. They were entrepreneurial. They saved their money. They had a communal treasury so that they could try to buy the land on which they lived. They, hired themselves out. They were skilled workers. They were just so brilliant and smart and resourceful and ambitious that I thought, well, here's the story that I can write that doesn't sink me into the pits of what I might have thought was the worst moment in our history.
All of those answers just, sucked you in. I don't know if anybody else in the room feels like that. But all of you all's books, y'all create such relatable and authentic characters where I feel like any reader who picks up your book should be able, not to necessarily relate like real life instances too much, but the feeling, the emotion, the interactions between people, that kind of thing. So how did you all do this while still staying true to the historical context of your novels?
You want me to start? Excellent question. I think the first thing you have to do is research, and research. And what I do is once I research something so well, then I can craft my characters, because I'm also very visual. So each time I'm writing a historical, I like to visit the place. And so I want to walk in the area where the people walked, even if it was 100 years ago that they actually were there. It helps me to see. And I like to craft my characters based on what was going on. For instance, I went into the Greenwood Cultural Center, and there was on the wall these testimonials or interviews that were done of survivors. And one of them said, we were preparing for college. We had such great hopes, but then there was no college. And that became my Evie, because I wanted her to be my character who was this dream deferred. And what happens when you've had your whole life set out before you, you had these plans, and all of a sudden your whole life is interrupted. How do you respond? And that was Evie all through the novel. Seeing her response was like a PTSD, even though it was not during those times. And so I'll let other people go on because there's multiple ways.
In my case, as I said, I was so focused on the characters and their relationship to one another that history or the time period didn't intervene so much. But when it did, like if I had two characters driving in a car and it was a nice car, I would research what those looked like, what they felt like, how fast they could go. But then you also have to consider if you have two people, say, driving in a car in a time period a long time ago, there's not going to be great roads, right? So it's not going to be a very comfortable ride. And my characters are driving. There's a scene where Jimmy and a great friend are on a back roads in Mississippi, which couldn't really be called roads at the time. So they're driving a fancy Cadillac, practically through mud roads. And so that allows you to let the outside environment kind of intervene on the conversation, and you're still trying to, in your head, or at least in mine, I can kind of hear the dialogue and each of their personalities, but history intervenes, but it's not really interrupting their conversation. It just adds an environment to it, and that, I think, that helped me, because I didn't want to become an expert on something or pretend an expertise on something that wasn't going to really serve the story. I wanted to tell an emotional story, which is what drove me to write it in the first place. The history matters, and it's quite fun and easier than it used to be to, look at if they have two characters who are walking to a building that was just made. Maybe it was much grander at that time than it would be now. So that can be a little bit a part of the conversation, but you still have to really remember why you're there.
I love the history part of it, and oddly, in a nerdy way, I love the research too, specifically as a writer of narrative of fiction and narrative nonfiction, focusing on the details and all that. But at heart, and this echoes back to what I said initially, I don't think of myself necessarily as an historical writer, as a writer of historical novels, because the thing that draws me is the characters. Like I remember growing up, on TV, and it was almost like when the villain walked in the room, you could identify him immediately. And that's less interesting to me. More interesting is the complexity of all of us. Sometimes we're the white hat, and sometimes we're wearing the black hat. And it shifts, it changes depending upon what's happening. So for me, the thing that draws me most to the stories is the complexity of the characters and how they how these characters evolve over time and have to make really hard decisions that sometimes force them to be the bad guy despite themselves. And so that's what I'm trying to do with the characters in these historical moments. My previous book, Black Cloud Rising, I was here in 22, similar. It's a Civil War story, but it's the Civil War story of brother against brother is one's the slave master's son, the other is also, but he's a slave. That's interesting to me, right? How they love each other and also don't know how to,
When I was growing up, I remember when rap music was born in New York City. And I went back to my daddy and I said, Daddy, have you heard this new thing called rap? And he said, new? That's not new. We had Gil Scott-Heron, even rapping before these rappers in New York ever. And I remember thinking Daddy just didn't understand. And then recently my teenager comes to me and asks me, have you ever heard of Marvin Gaye, Mama? And I guess what I'm trying to say is one of the things I remind myself when I'm thinking about characters from the past is that, there's nothing really new under the sun. That's something Daddy used to say too. Like, they're different from us in their perspective. I mean, clearly because we have so much access to information now that people in the past didn't. But they're also really similar to us. They also desired love, to love and be loved. They also, had sex, and got horny, Is this on C-SPAN? No, I don't think so. And see that big old camera back there. Oh, Lord. And, and they all, and so what I try not to let my research get in the way of the fundamental understanding of human beings. And I think the trick for anybody in here who wants to write historical fiction is knowing where to stop with the research, because the research can go on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. But at some point, you got to stop and ask yourself, who are these people? Mm-hmm. What do they want? What happened to them? what do they dream of? What are their disappointments in life? And you really have to put the research aside. I think too many novels that I read even, they're really driven by the research, but it has to be driven by the characters. And so one of the things I've even learned as I've continued on my journey of historical fiction is when to like get off the internet and get out of the library and just say to myself, who are these people? And that's what I'm chasing, is like the humanity in that moment.
Well, to piggyback off of that, so how difficult is that to separate your imaginative parts of the story versus still staying true to the authentic portions of your story?
See, for me, it's all imaginative, because even if I'm researching, I'm changing stuff.
Okay.
I'm like interpreting history. History is only a small part of history is factual, right? Like very small parts, like dates, things like that. But a lot of history is interpretive. And, that's why we have a whole field of historiography, right? Which is the examination of historical narratives. So I think as writers, we have to kind of see history as a living thing, not a static, stable thing. And if we do that, we know it's all imagination.
Okay.
Yeah. I would just add briefly, echoing exactly what Dolen's saying, they were in a different historical moment, but people just like us. And so they're confronting similar complications and dilemmas, just in a different context. So to me, that's the thing that I find, one of the things that I find super interesting is imagining the three young people in the New International, again, these people based on my parents, like what I was in my 20s, but in this really different moment. So yeah.
And go ahead. No.
So you got a thought. I'll figure out what to say after I hear what you say.
For me, and like I say, I'm very new to historical fiction writing, and so I've always wanted to honor these people who once lived on this earth and once, walked those streets, and that's why it's very important for me to go and actually see the areas. And so I try to stay as close to who the actual real people were if I'm writing about these real people. But because you're telling a historical novel, you're writing a historical novel, you have to bring in other characters and things like that to move the story along. And so there's always going to be, like Dolen said, the imagination part that you have to add into the story, because we're storytellers, so we have to add in with the research. Then we come in as the writer of the story and bring it all together.
In my case, it was almost like choose your own adventure, because there's, in Jimmy Rogers' life, I know he recorded with Louis Armstrong, and I knew he was friends with Howlin' Wolf, two of the great American musicians. But no one ever interviewed him about those meetings, and no one, there's very scant information about Louis and Howlin' Wolf's interactions with Jimmy. So I have these pillars. I know when he was born, I know basically where he lived and when he died, but within that, knowing that his relationships were wide and interesting, it allows me to be really creative. And I also have history, as far as research, I could read his letters, find out he's very articulate. He had a great sense of humor, great sense of humanity. So I have a sense of his personality, but there's so much that I can invent. I know the cities where he was going to be. I know where he was in Mississippi and in Texas. So that leaves me a really wide variety of locales to play with, and allows me to be creative and still keep with the facts. I can take him here, and I know that something happened here, whether it was a recording session or something important in his life. But then how he got there and what he did when he left is where things start to get kind of interesting. So it's a challenge to me, because I want to keep to the fidelity of the facts that are known. But the history that was never bothered to be researched and has kind of gone to the dust now is fertile ground for, a writer.
So I do want you all to share, because I feel like this could be a challenging, especially with historical fiction. To me, I feel like it could be challenging because as you have many historians out there who are going to always challenge your work for what you do either leave in or what you take out. So what would be your most what's the most challenging thing to you about writing within this particular genre?
Were you going to go? All right. Again, echoing Dolen earlier, it's easy to just keep doing research, and I am that person who tends to keep doing research. I enjoy it, like holding these documents and that are old. The novel I mentioned earlier, Black Cloud Rising, the Civil War novel, was an outgrowth of my first book. That was a narrative history, and I remember it was about the early Coast Guard, and my co-author and I had found the station logs, all the information ostensibly didn't exist, blah, blah, blah. I'm saying all that as a way to say we ended up making this research trip down to Atlanta where the logs were from the 1880s. And I remember there's these old documents and they give you these white gloves. And you put these white gloves on and you're holding these really 120-year-old documents. I remember opening the pages, there were these big log books, and opening the pages and these two pages were stuck together. And do I rip the page or no, So I could see it's something, and it's a bumblebee. A bumblebee had been pressed between the pages 100 and some odd years ago. That part of the history is awesome. Never made it into the book, So you do
That's
have
your next book, The Life of That Bumblebee.
The bumblebee.
You have to let go of the research, but ultimately, it's always there. So I think, verisimilitude sort of ends up being ingrained in your mind from doing that research, and as you're imagining, then you're just sort of getting something real on the page. I think I didn't quite answer your question, but
Yes, you did.
Okay.
You did.
That brings up a great point. If for me, knowing more than the characters do about their lives, or how their lives are going to be impactful, it's if it's an historical figure, but also what's about to happen, because I'm going to leave them at a time when there's going to be a lot of chaotic history. There's a war coming, there's labor unrest coming, there's race unrest coming. And I can allude to their relationships, or I can allude to the environment around their relationships, but I can't let on to them or the reader all that's going to come. And in a way, I'm always, at least in this book, it's my only book so far, I was sad to leave them because I liked these people, and I brought them to a point where I thought they could make something of their lives, make something interesting of their lives that they didn't have at the beginning of the book. But I also know what's going to, if they're real people, for almost all the people are in my book, I know it's coming, as I said. And so when I realized I was absolutely done, they're on a trajectory. I put them on a trajectory that I wanted them to be in because that felt right to me. But I know that life and history is going to put them in a completely different trajectory.
And so I would say the challenging part for me is pulling it all together. So as authors, we go to our editor and we say, oh, I have this great idea for a book. So I'm going to deal with the Threet Filling Station, this is an actual historical place where there was information about some of the people who escaped the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. They run to this Threet Filling Station, which becomes like their safe haven. So I wanted to deal with this idea of a safe haven when everything falls apart. But now you have to put it together. How do I bring the people from Greenwood to the Threet Filling Station, and how do I bring them back? Because the main part of the book is the people rebuilding Greenwood after it's been destroyed. And you think in the beginning, oh, this will be fine. This is great. Until you sit down and you try to put those pieces together. And then you go, what was I thinking? Why did I say I wanted to do this book in this way? And you hope that it turns out okay. So that's the most challenging to me, is putting it together after you have the idea.
Now, I'm going to tell you all, so a few of these books do have like a musical aspect to them. And I was kind of taken aback when I start, as I was reading, I was like, man, these are lyrics? People are singing in these books? Or even like even the words were kind of lyrical. Why, I want to ask the writers, what is the importance of course, incorporating music within your current work, and how did you choose where it should go and that kind of thing?
Do you want to?
Are you asking about actual music, or are you talking about lyrical language?
Lyrical language and actual music.
I can't remember if I have any actual music in this book. I will say something about lyrical language then. I don't know, I'm a failed poet. I wish I were a poet. David was just telling me about a poetry position at his university. I wish I could apply for it, I tried to write a poem, and one of my colleagues, who's a very accomplished poet, ripped it apart, and I was like, oh, thought that was good. I do think a lot about language. I do think carefully about word choice. I do a lot of line editing. I think about prosody in the way of a poet. I think about cadence. It's important to me that my fiction have a unique sound to it, like a unique voice. So I do read my work aloud a lot while I'm working. When I was working on Happy Land, my editor hired like a junior editor, and she was line editing me really strongly, and she was throwing off my music, and I had to sort of gently push back and say, I'm open to like marginal suggestions, but not to heavy like rearranging of my lines, because then I can't hear it anymore, and now I got your voice in my head. So, I can just say from that perspective, if you've read my work, it does all have a similar kind of voice, which I think is kind of minimalist lyricism.
I think this is unusual. It doesn't feel unusual to me, but I'm told it's unusual. But I'm that person who, I think a lot of times folks, when you're at home, maybe when you get up, the first thing you do is you turn on some music. I tend to walk around in silence. Music is not like a big part of my life in this way.
What?
And I know, it's surprising. But I have these, maybe this is part of the reason why it's not such a big part of my life. I have these memories of my mother. My mother used to love to dance and whatever. She was this 5'1" Jewish woman, and she'd be wearing these like African muumuus and pinching her lip and doing this dance. And it was almost like watching her have sex or something. I was like,
We're on
So-
C-SPAN, Dave.
oh, sorry.
C-SPAN.
So I just, I knew that music was important to her. I'm talking about the internationals now. And it was important to my father's too. And so I knew that music needed to be a part of it. And similar, but different but similar, knowing that music needed to be a part of the world that they were inhabiting as these young people in Paris, I imagined Louis Armstrong. I went to the people, the musicians they might have heard, and then did research in that way and tried to understand and create those scenes because it was important to the characters, so it had to be important to me. So that's how music worked its way into the New Internationals,
Well, I'm a songwriter, and in a way that helped me because I didn't know anything about writing fiction, and I felt compelled to write this book, and I really didn't want to, only in that I knew that what was ahead of me were many, many hours every day in total silence, where I was going to have to not only write it, but then come back the next day and do some copy editing, so it's at least readable. And in the world of music, if you make a record, you can always put it on in the background when you're having people over for dinner and get the sensation of what it's really like to listen to it as a regular person. And if people like it, say, oh, is this what you're working on? It sounds good. And in a way, that affirmation is plenty. But with a book, no one really wants to read your unfinished novel. And when it is finished, it's a huge responsibility, to sit down and read the whole thing. So you don't really getting any feedback. Whereas as a musician, you're getting kind of constant feedback from the people you play with. If you're singing or writing the music, if it's fun to play, it might be okay. And if it's fun for your friends to play, it might be okay. But if it's a drag, you can move on to something else or play somebody else's song. So you don't have that advantage as a writer. But for me, one advantage that creeped in about halfway was I realized that, in songs, there's moments of ambivalence where you really don't, you can say two things at once in the same line. It can be a nice line, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. And I found a way to do that naturally in my writing. And there are some holes in the story where you're not exactly sure maybe what happens, but you're at least in the direction of what might happen. And if I hadn't been a songwriter, I think I might have put pressure on myself to try to answer every possible moment in every corner and light every hallway and light every candle and blow out every candle on the way out. And the nature of real life, I think, is that you move through life and you have relationships and you can paint the picture when you're telling a story, but you're not necessarily telling every little fact. And there's almost an compulsion to do that when you're writing history, because you've done all this research and you kind of want to show it off because it's interesting to you. And again, the characters pull you back, and you have to be human about it, which means a lot of times there's going to be some ambivalence, even when you don't mean there to be.
And I was this frustrated contemporary writer who loved to have music help me tell my story, but my editor would scratch it out every time I would put it in a novel, and she would say, that is copyrighted material and we cannot use it. So when I decided I was going to write historical, and the first one, as I said, was The American Queen, and discovered that Luella was a singer, I said, well, they can't stop me now, because after 100 years, there's no copyright on anything. And so it was in the 1800s. So I put 10 songs in The American Queen. And if you listen to the audio, the narrator sings those songs in the audio. But I also have songs in the filling station. She doesn't sing them in the audio, and I don't know why she didn't. I was hoping she would, and that's why we used the same narrator, because I loved what she did. But so for the filling station, it was 1920s. I wanted to use jazz music in there as a backdrop for, as I said, I love to have the music tell the story that I am trying to show you just with my prose. And I was able to find different sections of jazz music that I could use in certain parts of the book that would tell you the story of what Evie was going through at that moment. So if you were paying attention as you were reading it, when you would see her in different areas, and I would have a song, I would have a few lines of a song, Because They Can't Stop Me Anymore, it would really be telling the story of what Evie was going through.
And that was one of the most interesting things to me, you all, because I'm like, if you can do that, you're almost genius, incorporating the lyrical style of writing.
Did you just call me a genius?
Yes, all of you. All of you, you know what I'm saying? Having that lyrical, just takes a lot to have cadence and all of that, along with wonderful writing. You have to be genius to do that. My next question is just right up my alley, because if you know the Melanated Reader, you know I love drama and I love a lot of mess. And all of you all have your own little aspect of mess. And I wanted to know, was there any other additions that you wanted to add? And your editor was like, no, you already have enough. You've topped your cap on mess in this particular book. You're going to have to save it for the next thing that you do. I don't know what that's going to be. But I did want to know that.
I honestly can't think of anything messy that I had to leave out of the novel. I do remember we had to shorten some of the things that I wanted to add because of the fact that I add epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter. And those were important to me because those also help to tell the story of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, but they also told the story of a rotten Red Cross system that devalues Black Americans. And when I found that 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Red Cross report, I sat in my office and I was angry just at the wording that they were using because they were dealing with Black Americans. But these were successful Black Americans. These were entrepreneurs. These were business owners who had their whole area had been bombed and they'd lost everything. And it was as if they now they wanted a handout when what they needed was a hand up. And so I got so angry with it. And again, that 100-year mark, when I sat in my office and I realized that that report was 100 years old, I emailed my editor and I said, I'm gonna let my readers know what the Red Cross was saying about these people who needed support at this time. And so instead of not being able to use certain things, I was allowed to add something in there that I felt was important. And if you read them, you'll see why I felt it was important to add and then to leave out some other things.
The question is something messy?
Yes.
I got one for that. So Jimmy is a very sort of sacrosanct, because that's the right word, person in music history because he's so influential. But because he was dying of tuberculosis, he really was also dependent on morphine for the rest of his life. And he was also probably taking a little bit of cocaine or some other stimulant with that, basically a speedball, just to be able to get up for his performances.
Wow.
But I chose not to, it's alluded to and it's in there, but I chose not to overemphasize it because he also just worked constantly. He was constantly touring. He was trying to keep himself alive. He was also trying to send money back to his family. That's really why he went to New York for his, in music history, a very famous recording session, which he died the day after. And he probably got a pretty heavy shot just to stay alert for that final recording, which probably led to his death afterwards, which in the world of music history is a big deal. But because I had real letters to look at and I knew that his work ethic was really good, he was quite funny, he didn't ever emphasize his illness, I didn't feel like I should either, because that's just part of the world of if you were sick with that at that time, that's what you had to do. And instead, it gave me the opportunity for him to sort of doze off or disappear from the story and wake back up and find himself in a situation and have to try to figure out how the hell he got there, right? So it gave me an opportunity to make a choice whether to emphasize that or de-emphasize it, and I thought he was more interesting if it was lurking in the background, but it was not so much a part of the story.
From my vantage point, all fiction is about trouble, right? We pick up a novel and we keep turning the pages because we're anticipating something, we're fearing something, whatever it is. And so it hasn't been so much about cutting it out as much as managing it. You know, the novel earlier on was doing this, as these three characters, and characters had siblings and family and this and that and whatever. And every character, if they're all complex in their own ways, all have trouble, complexity. So it's a bad analogy because I'm as bad with cooking as I am with music. But I imagine sort of when you're baking, and you fold back over layers, and so as opposed to having the cake or whatever, the pastry thing do this, you fold it and it gets dense and does this. And so the characters, by folding the complexity, by eliminating some characters and folding their complexity into other characters or other things, then those characters get more interesting, I think. So it was about managing.
And y'all, he does have some mess in his book, okay? Because the main character, the young lady, was on my nerves the entire book. Okay. Just to be honest, okay? So I was like, what is happening here? Okay. So now I'm going to open it up to anybody who does have a question for our authors that are on panel. Yes, sir.
That's an excellent question, actually. I think it's different for every novel. This particular novel, The Filling Station, I had two characters with their point of views. And in my opinion, you don't want to juggle too many because I'm actually writing on two different books. One of them right now, I have three characters that will have a point of view. And you have to be careful because you have to make sure that each one comes off different. And sometimes that gets a little jumbled in a novel because you have to start from page 1 all the way to 300, 400, and you can forget that you're actually writing the same character in one of the other characters if you're not careful. So you have to, I would minimize it, is what I'm saying. I wouldn't have too many.
Especially with secondary characters. With the main character, it's you know, you're focused on that. I'm focused on those characters in a specific way. But secondary characters oftentimes are more situational. I need something to happen in a certain way. And that's where, for me, I find the stories can kind of start to sprawl in a certain way. And I'm also, the New International started out as 500 pages. It was big, manuscript pages. And I thought it was working. And my previous agent circulated it. She thought it was working. She described back to me exactly what it was I thought I'd written. And all the feedback was everybody rejected it. And it was a rejection in a certain way where I understood in part that I'm not the right person to write that big, sprawling book. I don't read them, right? I rarely read them. I slow down, I get bored. And so part of that for me is a function of plot, you know. If I can keep the secondary characters in control, then I can manage the plot and keep the plot driving forward. I tend to be drawn to books where not necessarily that are like thrillers or whatever, but where the trouble keeps driving me forward. Yeah. Does that make sense?
I think also people define, in my case, people define themselves by what they do. They're very proud of what they do. Yeah, we all have to work. You have to do it for a long day, you know, 8 or 9, 10 hours a day. So if the characters who are in the story, in my case, all the characters outside the main character related to my main character in some aspect of his work. Jimmy was a musician, so there's people who recorded with him. His wife, who wasn't music related, so that's a different relationship. The people he worked with have a different relationship. The people he did business with in the music business had a unique perspective. And so for me, one thing one could think about is starting about like, what does someone do? What is their spiritual address? You know, how do they define themselves? What language do they speak? Big family, small family, religious family, agnostic family. And even if those don't get into the story, it helps you develop their voice and how they might react to your character. And it kind of can play in your head and feel more natural because even though you know more than you're going to say, that's helpful to you because you feel like you know this character, and so you can kind of put aside something that doesn't really fit the story, but helps move the story along.
Yes.
Did you find agent and publisher first, or did you just write it all and then find the right agent?
I think if you were writing nonfiction, you could sell a book proposal, but in the fiction world, you have to have a book. Unless you have been publishing in like the top literary journals and they can see some of your short fiction is really promising, or you graduate from a top MFA program like Iowa Writers Workshop, sometimes they get picked up. You can get picked up if you've shown some kind of extraordinary promise. If your short story wins an O. Henry Award or a Pushcart Prize or what was that other thing, Malamud Award. But otherwise, typically, you need the whole book. They need to just know that you can finish a manuscript. It's a lot to put down 100,000 words. It's a lot.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with a caveat from the previous question. It was 500 pages. It's now just 300 pages. So don't let the 500-page thing I said before scare you off. But the business part of it, I teach in an MFA program, and one of the things that I try to impart to my students above all is stick-to-itiveness. So the New International, or Black Cloud Rising, was the one before this was my third book, and I'd had agents before. Black Cloud Rising, that came out from the same publisher in 22. I originally started, again, I'd had experience, I'd written 2 books, I'd had agents previously, I needed to find a new agent because the previous one was the woman who couldn't sell the version of this one. And I mean, it wasn't her fault. Again, it was a 500-page monstrosity. But I'm saying all that as a way to say, in my mind, I remember reading when I was first like a young student about On the Road, and Jack Kerouac with On the Road couldn't land it. And apparently it went to like 50 editors, and it was the 50th editor who bought it. That was the story of a struggling book. So in my mind, I'm like, I'm going to query, I'm beginning to get rejection. Some of them are a little bit more positive than others. In my mind, I'm telling me, I'm going to go to 50. And 50 is going to be the measure. I get to 50, I've gotten a number of rejections, but that are positive. Like they're describing to me in their rejections what it was I thought I did. But they're telling me things like, well, I don't think I can sell it, or this and that, whatever. Okay, I'll keep going. I went to 100. Same thing. It takes a long time. You get thick skin. It's painful. But I'm like, I'll keep going a little bit farther. I got to 150. 150 rejections. Wow. And a friend has a friend who was an editor of a small press. In my mind, I just thought, okay, I'm a small press writer. I know there's quality here because I can tell by the way it's being rejected. But maybe it just is not a big audience book. So I was going with the small press. This was right before the pandemic. And I was traveling. The pandemic happened, and this weird sort of misunderstanding / dispute happened with the small press. And it became this thing where it started feeling like she was clearly supportive, but she was asking me to sort of invest in it in a way that's sort of feeling more like self-publishing. And I think that's a great route if that's the route you choose, but that's not what I was trying to do. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm out, And I pulled out. So at that point, 150 rejections, an editor that I've now rejected from a small press. I'm like, okay, I'm basically a failed writer. And in that moment of sort of despair or whatever, I stumbled on this website of a screenwriter who had some beef, and he published all the email addresses of those agents whose email addresses you cannot get, right? And one of them I recognized, Eric Simonoff. I'd read this interview with him 10 years before, but he just struck me. We're about the same age, and it just struck me, and there's his email address. So I made up some excuse about how I got his email address, queried him. He loved the book, read it in 2 days, loved the book, and sold it. Wow. Stick-to-itiveness.
Yeah.
The business is terrible. It's mercurial. You can't predict it. You just stick to it.
I would add to just enjoy yourself and finish it, because especially from a musical standpoint, my music experience of making records and then trying to find a home for them, it's business and pleasure, and it's really hard to write, and you may second guess yourself, but if you know how you want to finish the book, just finish it, because and be happy that you did. You know, in my case, I didn't know if anybody would publish it. I didn't know if I would finish it. I didn't have an agent. I thought it would never leave my desk drawer. And then could be a whole other panel of all the crazy stuff that happened that got me here and got it published. And I will say that everyone who helped me along the way, they happened to be in the right place at the right time, including my original editor at the University of Georgia Press, who went on maternity leave like 2 weeks after I signed the contract and never came back to the press. So if she had gotten the book a month later, after lots of other rejections from other presses, I wouldn't even be here. So enjoy it and get it done in a way where you can read it and go, I think this is good, and I think this is as good as I can make it. And when you can almost as passionately as humanly possible feel like that you've done a really good job, even if it's just 3 chapters, you know, just get something done where you read it over and over again, you say, I like this. And if you can like it, that will, I believe, someone else will at least find the thing in it that's special to the outside world and help you along. But to try to do those 2 things at the same time, especially if you're a first-time writer, is really hard, yeah.
But we're querying agents, and I think they've all copied and pasted. Sounds good, but not a good fit.
Right, and
Right.
so
And that's
so
hard.
let me here's the one thing that a lot of people don't know when they're first beginning, is that when you're just querying these agents and you're mailing this in, they don't have a face in front of them, so it's easy to reject you because they have so much of a workload already. The best way for you to get an agent or an editor when you're new is to go to these writer conferences. There are a lot of writer conferences that are out there that editors and agents show up to these, and they take pitches from authors. Now, they're coming to listen to these pitches to think that they're going to reject every one of them. But if your pitch happens, if your pitch happens to be something that they've never heard before, and it sounds like, oh my goodness, this is something I cannot live without, they're going to ask you for that manuscript. And so, for instance, the way I was published probably with my 4th book by the time I got an agent. And the way I actually got my first agent was networking. So another way you can do this is I knew an author, and I happened to ask her, who is your agent? And she told me who her agent was, and I said, well, right now I'm looking for an agent. Do you mind if I give you my information and you see if she's interested? So she sent it to her agent, and she contacted me back, and she became my agent for almost 20 years until she retired. And then I'm now with my second agent, but only because my first one retired. And I love her so much, and we're still in contact. So those are other ways you can try and think of, rather than just trying to send out queries blindly, because they're going to ignore you. And your story could be really good, but you have to understand the nature of the beast. There's just so much work that's already out there. There are so many authors that they don't have to say yes. You have to give them a reason to say yes.
And not give them a reason to say no.
Correct.
Well, I will say this. I hate to end it here, but you all, this concludes our presentations for today. Let's give it up for these wonderful authors.